Thank you very much. We're speaking to Paul Miller, who's affiliated with the McDaniel College in Westminster, Maryland in the United States. He's here at our conference on the Histories of 1914, and who had his presentation yesterday. And you were talking about, you entitled your presentation, Yugoslav Eulogies, the Footprints of Gavrilo Princip, and you were basically following the way that Gavrilo Princip was portrayed or not portrayed or perceived or debated through Yugoslav history, not only post-World War II, but also the interwar periods. And you made some quite interesting analysis there, and I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit on that.
Sure, thank you very much. I guess I would start by saying that what I'm interested in is both popular memory of the assassination, who was making the greatest effort to turn the assassination to an act of resistance against the Austro-Hungarian regime and liberation in a positive sense, and what the government's response to that was, a combination of those two things, and then to a lesser but not insignificant extent, the outside world and how they saw what was going on in terms of remembrance of the Sarajevo assassination. So I going from 1918 through the Second World War and then the post-war period and then the breakup of Yugoslavia, you see certain commonalities, but also certain differences that developed. I mean, in interwar Kingdom of Yugoslavia, the government is very hands-off of this. Doesn't play a role in any of the commemorative events. An official plaque is not placed on the site of the assassination until 1930, and then the government doesn't send any ministers to attend the official commemoration of the plaque or anything like that, and it's kind of downplayed even in the local press. But if you look at the popular press, if you look at the Yugoslavist oriented journals and newspapers, you see an effort amongst not only Serbs and Bosnian Serbs, but people from different ethno-national religious backgrounds in Yugoslavia, in the kingdom of the South Slavs, to elevate the assassins as a positive national narrative. During the Titoist period, the government does take a more positive position on this, but when 1964, the 50th anniversary, so you get a museum, you get the footprints, but it's still kind of Sarajevo-based. You do get streets named in Belgrade and other cities for the assassins, which you didn't have at all in the interwar period. But when 1964, the 50th anniversary comes around, the government still kind of plays it down officially, leaves it in the hands of local officials. Some local officials are told to play it down in front of the international press, which still sees this as the trigger for the First World War, as opposed to a great act of national liberation. And then this whole narrative explodes when Yugoslavia explodes in the early 1990s. And almost immediately, in fact, even before hostilities break out in Bosnia, there's a debate over the so-called Princip Bridge, and graffiti appears the next day in front of the museum, and the language of hero versus terrorist starts cropping up. After the war, you see this division in Bosnia most clearly. With the division of Bosnia comes the division of national narratives concerning the assassination. And I try to look at the ways in which those national narratives can inform us about the whole Yugoslav project writ large, but also considering the fact that for everyone outside of Yugoslavia, this is not simply an act of a political murder, a political assassination, an act of resistance that in some ways can be seen as righteous based on the very colonial-like conditions under which people were living, if you believe that that is a morally justified act to take. But elevating it into something legendary ignores the fact that everybody else understands this as its association with the First World War, and Yugoslavia only came about as a consequence of the First World War. Now, whether or not it would have, under other circumstances, or evolved more organically, let's say with a gradual breakup of the empire that may have taken place 20 years down the road or 50 years down the road, I don't know, we can't predict. But in other words, it's this tension that kind of constantly exists, and I think is the reason that the kingdom of Yugoslavia is completely ambivalent, and in socialist Yugoslavia still plays it down to a certain extent for the international media, and today there's a difficulty of grappling with this because it's not just a locally important event, but it's an internationally important event. Whereas there's lots of political assassinations that have great meaning just for those countries, this one applies to a lot more people, and so that has created some of the ways in which I try to deal with how Yugoslavs have eulogized the assassins over the course of the last 100 years.
No, that was very fascinating, sort of the way you depicted that transformation. But I would just maybe that something that could be particularly interesting. There is one particular case or one peculiar scene that you explored from the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken, for the 50th anniversary, where a certain father of a certain very prominent director from nowadays, Bosnia, Serbia, one doesn't know exactly how he defines himself, said certain things. I was wondering whether you could sort of...
Well, I mean, it's amazing the things you can find in your research. And basically, when I was collecting newspaper articles for 1964, the 50th anniversary, and lots of foreign reporters were there, including from the London Times and the New York Times, etc., I got a quotation in the New York Times article, and it said the commissar or whatever, I can't remember the official title, but it was some communist functionary position dealing with the media by the name of Murat Kusturica. And I thought, wow, I wonder if he could at all be related to Emir Kusturica. And so I asked someone who was very informed about Sarajevo. He said, yeah, Murat Kusturica was Emir Kusturica's father. And in the quotation that I have from the New York Times article, the Murat Kusturica is playing down the assassination for the foreign press, saying, oh, the partisans were really important, but my son, he doesn't even know about Princip and the assassins, but the partisans, they were really important, because socialist Yugoslavia was about making this analogy between the multinational partisans and the multinational young Bosnians. And so, of course, 50 years later, we well know that Emir Kusturica is at the forefront of representing the assassination as a very positive, largely Serbian nationalist narrative, with his famous picture in the newspaper kissing the statue in Tomarishevo in Serbia that was just dedicated this past spring of 2014. So there's great irony there, and again, you never know what crops up in the newspapers from 50 years ago. Yeah.
No, you made this transition to narrate or the establishment of meta narratives in nowadays Southeastern European societies, and maybe you could sort of elaborate a bit more on that, on the way that the World War I has been reinvigorated or reintroduced into public discourse and public memory so forcefully, particularly now with the Centennial, and what your interpretation is on that.
In a broad Eastern European
Well, no, you can sort of focus it on Serbia as the epicenter, but in the post-Yugoslav space, one might say.
My feeling about that, and it's an interesting question, because I started this research when I thought, wow, 2014 was a long way off. I started my academic career in French history, actually, and then got interested in the assassination as a site of memory, and thought that one chapter of my project would be on Yugoslav and ex-Yugoslav memory. And then as I went to Sarajevo in 2004, a good decade before everybody was starting to think about this, or at least, let's say 7-8 years before people were panicking about the Centennial, and started learning the language and everything, I realized, wow, this is really a big topic. This could be a book in and of itself. And so most of my research was up to about 2008, 2009 in the published article. I probably have a few things in Serbian newspapers and Bosnian newspapers, particularly from around 2010, 2011. But then all of a sudden, this is a very strange experience for an historian. There's an explosion of interest in exactly what you've been doing, and that explosion is not just amongst academics, but it's in the popular sphere. And in a way, I guess, as I'm observing this conference and thinking, wow, maybe if I ever do expand this research and turn it into a book, the original article was 30,000 words, so it was ridiculously long. I had to cut tremendously already. then that would certainly include a chapter dealing with 2014. I think it's very important for people to have, and from what I've heard at the conference and what I've observed, and I have a research assistant collecting articles, and obviously I saw Biljana Srbljanović's play at its international opening. I was only thinking of the German word, in Vienna, and the way she deals with it, and we heard a paper at the conference from Muharrem Bazdul about another Serbian playwright and how she deals with the assassination in a very different way. I think that these are ultimately, though that national narrative still predominates, though the government still is not reining it in to any extent, other than going off, outside of Belgrade to hold the ceremony as opposed to doing it in the capital. I think that there is a process going on of discussion that I'm seeing that's positive to a certain extent. This conference in Sarajevo, which I did not attend, fortunately, did seem, from everything I've heard and read about it, to go off fairly positively in that it, wasn't a lot of nationalist propaganda, from what I've heard. I still have to sort of analyze everything. So I think that this is a good process to go through, and I was very interested in the paper that we heard on the Europeanization part of all of this, because on the one hand, the idea of this being all about reconciliation in the Balkans, I find a bit patronizing. I find that as the EU saying, well, we don't want you guys touching World War I in your proposals to us. We've got $2 million to divvy out here. But on the other hand, if you do something on reconciliation, then we'll hand out the money. And that's kind of, again, Europe imposing itself on what's necessary for Balkan healing. And I think that the people of the region are in the process of dealing with that, and economic stability will help a lot when that hopefully comes sooner or later. But my observations up to this point are that there is still a distance to go, but the conversation and the diverse ways in which the assassination's been represented artistically, theatrically, etc., leaves open, and in journal articles that I've read, where it's really been criticized by some intellectuals too, is how do you glorify something like this? I mean, it's not like the rest of our history in the next 100 years was positive. On the other hand, yeah, one could certainly say it was a political assassination in a colonialist system. It's not, it wasn't all, simply immoral kind of, one needs to problematize and understand, and I hope that process is starting in 2014
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Paul, for
Thank you
agreeing
very
to talk
much.
to us.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks.
And
Great.
you'll stay in Grant.
Great. Good.
Thanks.
Thanks very much.
Right.